Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Nunez. I am a member of the Durham Racial Equity Task Force, and I'm here to talk to you about using data to implement policies and actions for a more equitable community. Um, the Durham Racial Equity Task Force was originally started in 2018 when Mayor Pro Tempore Jillian Johnson decided and came up with the idea to have Durham and its residents make up a racial equity task force to talk to the city about policy to help the city tackle some of these big issues using a racial equity lens. Okay, there were 17 members picked. I was one of those members, and out of our work came a report that was presented to the City Council on July 22nd of 2020. At the end of the presentation, there's a link for the report for you so you can take a look at it. It's about 60 pages. It's a short read. So if you're interested, the report will be there, okay? And essentially, our work really focused on 6 areas. We looked at putting up a racial equity lens to try to look at these issues through that lens. We looked at wealth and economy, the criminal legal system, health and environmental justice, housing, education, and public history. These were areas that the group identified as areas where racial equity work is needed. And it was also important for us to identify these areas and their interconnectedness. You know, these areas are really connected with each other, and that was fascinating in our research, how one thing affected the other. It was just like a domino effect. So these really were the 6 major areas that we focused on. There were a lot of other things that we just didn't have time to tackle, but we did the best that we could with the time that we had. I was mostly involved with the criminal legal system subcommittee and the housing subcommittee. I'm a criminal lawyer and an immigration lawyer. That's what I do for a living. So I had a special interest in those areas, but you know, we had such great folks in our task force that are still continuing to do this work, and I'm very, very honored to have spent that time with them. So first I want to talk to you just about 2 things we're going to talk about today. The first thing is going to be the challenges facing immigrants identified by the task force. And this is near and dear to my heart. And the second thing we're going to talk about is data and its role in the criminal legal system as we see it, okay? So let me see here. So when we started doing this work, there were some issues that were identified very early on, especially in the criminal legal system and in the education system, or in the education subcommittee, about big challenges facing immigrants, new immigrants to this country, folks that have been here a little bit longer. We talked about family separation. We talked about barriers to achieving legal status. There were concerns about culturally competent healthcare and mental health services, housing insecurity, language access services, and a wealth gap. So the first thing that we want to discuss is, you know, this family separation. This came into play when we saw ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, essentially come into communities and start arresting folks. And this caused family separation that we saw, where maybe the mom and the children were behind, and now the father is in custody in Georgia or in another detention facility. And this seemed to have a big impact on the family unit, big impact on the family's ability to support itself, on the children's education, their mental health, medical health, and essentially affected the whole system of the family. So this is one of the identified issues within our report. that was important for us to focus on. Second issue, obviously, is barriers to achieving legal immigration status in this country, depending on the particular person's situation. Without legal immigration status, sometimes it is difficult to gain employment, to secure housing, to secure financial stability for a family, to sometimes secure educational stability for children. So all these things were really interconnected. The third thing that we looked at was culturally competent healthcare and mental health services. And we saw this obviously come up during COVID, and especially in the very early stages where COVID numbers in the Latino community were off the charts. This access to competent healthcare, culturally competent healthcare, and mental health services for immigrants is really, really, really important, because when we have our health and we're taken care of, everything else can happen. When we have people who are not taking care of themselves, who are not going to the doctor because they think the doctor, is going to call immigration on them, or they're not going to the doctor because they're afraid they're not going to get the care that they deserve or they need. These things become barriers. They can't go to the doctor because they can't communicate with the doctor. So all these things came up during our research. Housing insecurity, we see this in Durham. The housing market is crazy right now. There's, seems to be a lot of displacement in Durham, Raleigh, a lot of these big cities there's a lot of displacement of Black and brown people. And this is one of the identified barriers and challenges. Language access was a big one, especially in the school system. It's not just language access for the children, it's language access for the parents. Having the parents be the link between the school and the children is incredibly important. Having parents be informed, and parents want to participate in the children's education, and they want their voice heard. And a lot of times, language access seems to be a big barrier for teacher communication, having parent-teacher conferences, these kind of things. So that was a big identifier within the educational system. And the wealth gap, which is just sort of a overwhelming point that, if we have family separation or we have one of these other challenges, the income of the family is certainly going to be lower. There's going to be a wealth gap. And this is just another issue that was identified. So these are just some of the issues. There are certainly a lot more, but these were some of the bigger issues that were communicated to us. And the task force met with a lot of community groups. The task force met with community members, with agencies, with law enforcement, with elected folks. And I think a lot of these challenges came out of those conversations. But I will say one of the pieces of feedback that we got back is that there wasn't enough relating to our immigrant population in our report. And I do agree with that. I think moving forward, one of the recommendations that we made to the city was that there would be a permanent racial equity task force, and essentially making that racial equity task force a racial equity commission and continuing that work. And I think that's something hopefully we'll see in the future to tackle a lot more of these issues as we move forward. So I want to move on to data. In our report for the criminal legal system, we had recommendations that we gave to the city, and I won't go through all of them because the report is attached or linked to this presentation, but You know, we had a big recommendation on decriminalizing substance abuse and use in our city, in our county. There was a recommendation about jury pools and essentially having a more representative jury pool in our county that really represents the residents of our county, okay? Then we had a recommendation, which I'm gonna read to you here, which is we recommend that our law enforcement agencies engage in or partner with institutions to collect accessible data on race, gender, and ethnicity. This data should include traffic stops, arrests, and the use of force incidents. It should be available to the public. And we also recommend a separate database documenting police officer misconduct managed by an independent entity. Ideally, disciplinary personnel records for law enforcement would also be available via Freedom of Information at request from the public. So I want to sort of explain kind of the background to this recommendation. Our subcommittee understood that in North Carolina, there's already a law that requires law enforcement to disclose this data, okay? But I think for us, it was important to reiterate its importance. And we want to push our law enforcement to collect more data, more robust data, to try to be able to analyze this data as we move forward, okay? So, like I said, North Carolina requires agencies to report their data on a monthly basis to the Department of Justice. Some data sets are incomplete, remain unreported. Data is often limited to traffic stops and use of force, which we see in North Carolina. You know, the bulk of the information that we have is about traffic stops. And just a snippet, since we're talking about the Durham Racial Equity Task Force, Durham, Black people are 37% of the population, white people are 54% of the population, Hispanic people 13.7%. According to the census from 2019, in 2018, Black drivers accounted for 61% of the traffic stops, and white drivers 26%, Hispanic drivers 10%. So this shows you right here the disparity between the population and the actual stops. So you're saying we have 37% of the Durham population that are Black, and we have 61% of our traffic stops essentially being Black drivers. So there's definitely something going on there, right? So that's one of the things that open data policing, if you go on there, you can type any police department, sheriff's office, even the highway patrol, and it'll show you the mostly traffic stop data, but you'll see it there by race, ethnicity. They put it all together, which is something I think that's hopefully needs to be changed, but you'll see the data on there, and you can look for yourself and look at any police department. And I think when we look at this information, you know, there are a lot of limitations on data collection. You know, one of the things that I noticed is, you know, most of this collection happens on the ticket. You know, the ticket, whatever they're handed to the person has, you know, what race are you? You know, why am I stopping you? Those kind of things. So there are some limitations on that data collection. You know, you have an officer who's making a determination on your race and ethnicity. You know, they don't ask you, you know, they just check a box. Sometimes that data is not reported or it's misreported. You know, there's no analysis at this point based on the data collected. We see open data policing doing some analysis, but, you know, we want the police to go back and take its own data and do some analysis. And, you know, I think in order to have departments do that, we have to fund that. You know, I think law enforcement agencies are stretched out as it is, and I think it's important, if we want this work to happen, you know, we need to fund it. And I think when we're doing this, when we're asking agencies to collect this data, it does add extra costs, you know, manpower. We're just looking at extra expenses the collection and the analysis of this data. And like I said, there's some limited data. A lot of it is traffic stops. And there's use of force data that's collected, but it's limited also. So I think some of this calls for more robust data collection and hopefully more reporting of data, not less. Okay. So I wanted to touch on a couple of things as it relates to data collection. Here, we don't have this, but in New York, especially New York City, they have an officer misconduct database. So there's a couple of things that they have that was brought on by basically a lawsuit. The ACLU was able to obtain this officer misconduct data, which was complaints that people filed to the Civilian Review Board that they had in New York City. And through a Freedom of Information Act request, the ACLU was able to get all of these complaints. The complaints, I believe, start in 1994, so there's limited availability between 94 and 2000, and then from 2000 on, they do have full availability of these complaints. So you can basically, it works very similar to a Google search. You can type in the officer's name and it'll pop up, if there's any complaints against that officer. One other thing that New York City has is that it has a separate database for civil rights lawsuits that have been brought against officers. And essentially this keeps, a record of the lawsuits that, one single officer has. So it's just interesting ways of tracking this misconduct. I think it's important also for departments to have that information. And I think it's very important for the public to have access to that information. So those are just a couple of ways that, New York City has been collecting this information and disseminating the information. Something that may be done here in North Carolina at some point, but just are some examples for us to look at. So I've provided the link, I think on the last page, for the civil rights lawsuits. So moving forward, I think in looking at this and in examining this huge issue with data in law enforcement and collecting all this data, I think we have to think of data as a really important tool in the struggle for true racial equity. I think when we have law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, everybody using data, analyzing data, and having data-driven prosecutions, data-driven law enforcement, I think it makes our community better than what it was. I will say we're lucky in Durham. We have a great DA who's doing wonderful things when it comes to restorative justice practices and using data to track that restorative justice process and partnering with community agencies. So all that becomes a huge important part of using data, is not only just collecting the data, but partnering with agencies that will help you analyze that data, using the results of your data analysis to further what you're trying to do. So it's really, really important for us to continue to use data as we move forward. And it's important because we want to achieve more equitable outcomes. And I think by using data, everyone can see, where we are, where we want to be. And I think data collection has to be more robust. And like I said, we need to give agencies the tools to do this data collection analysis. And if we don't, we need to have community partners that can do this, universities. We want to be able to expand our data collection and analysis, especially, in my opinion, with law enforcement, with DA's offices, public defenders' offices, and these agencies, probation, all these places. to have more equitable outcomes in our criminal legal system. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Just a couple of links for you. There is a link for the report, and there's also the link for the North Carolina Open Data Policing, where you can see all of this is going to be specifically Durham Police Department. But like I said, you can look through every police department. It works very similar to a Google search, so you can look at the statistics. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And I know now it's time for questions, so feel free to ask away.